Hello and welcome to the 12th video report of our What If interactive wargame campaign run here at the Battle of Preston Pans Museum in East Lothian. This time we don't just have one battle for you, we have two, as four armies battle it out over the 3 days that will decide the destiny of a dynasty.
So here we are at last into the final week of January 1746 and the Jacobite army making its final approaches towards London. We have got loads to cover today, so this is a special bumper edition as we carry ourselves through the events of the 23rd to the 27th of January. Welcome to all of those who are new subscribers. I hope you've managed to catch up with where things have got to so far. And of course, for those who've been following ever since this campaign began, I hope you're going to enjoy where it's got to now. So let's just remind ourselves where we left off. We have Charles Edward Stuart and the main Jacobite army up there in the north coming down towards London on the Great North Road. We also have the French who'd landed near Hastings and are making their way up towards London from the south. But they are not going to be unopposed. George II and the Duke of Cumberland are gathering every able-bodied man in London, whilst a small army of Hessians has arrived at Chatham and is there to reinforce the king or indeed to support his operations. I didn't really introduce the French army when we spoke last, so here they are. The French forces have landed under the Duc de Richelieu, and he has arrived with a considerable force, 11 battalions of infantry, and many of those are French regulars. We've got 2 battalions of the regiments of Crillon and Orléans, and we've got a single regiment of the Beauvoisis regiment. He's also got 4 regiments of French regular cavalry as well. More than half of the French infantry comprises the Irish Brigade of French service. The 6 regiments that have come across, minus those few pickets that had been sent earlier in the campaign to support the Jacobites, who you might recall were lost in the actions in front of the walls of Newcastle upon Tyne. So the Irish are likely to play a substantial role in any action that takes place in the Kent campaign. Meanwhile, the Prince of Hesse-Cassel himself has landed with 6 battalions of Hessian foot, 2 regiments of horse, hussars in fact, and a number of artillery pieces, a substantial force, although considerably smaller than that of the French. Now, our French friends down at the bottom of the map could have spent time consolidating their position in the south of England, perhaps securing the advantages of a harbour for themselves larger than the one at Hastings, but they've decided that they want to put immediate pressure onto London to support the Jacobite advance. So they're moving forward towards the Medway. King George, however, has decided that he's not going to bring the Hessians into London in order to reinforce his own army. Instead, he's ordered them to go down the Medway from Rochester and hopefully to block the path of the French, to keep the French out of the campaign for the capital. Now, as the British government has been aware of the risk of a French invasion for some time, they'd been taking action to be able to improve the local defences. And one of the things that they've been doing is demolishing the river crossings along the River Medway, hoping to bottle the French up in the south. But of course, they've left one open that they can control, and that is the bridge at TONBRIDGE, which has been determined to be the most defensible, potentially south of Rochester. So both the French and the Hessians are heading towards Tonbridge, and this is a map of the town as it appeared in the mid-18th century. There is the River Medway running through the middle, and in fact there's a branch of the Medway running around here as well. So there are in fact 2 river crossings that the French have to secure. The little bridge down there at the bottom and the big bridge. You will notice that the big bridge is protected by the ruins of the castle, and then, of course, the town of Tonbridge itself. French will be approaching from the south, and they will be coming past the ruins of the old abbey towards the little bridge. The Hessians, they will be coming down from the north, and they will be coming down to support the local militia who've been raised and the gentlemen volunteers who've supported them. The locals are not happy at having a French army in Kent. So, two views of mid-18th century Tonbridge here. The one in the inset picture, the bottom corner there, as it appeared in the 18th century, is drawn by a visitor, and then the main picture as it appears on our tabletop. The river crossing there, that's the big bridge, dominated by the ruins of the castle, which had been slighted after the Civil War. Now, the French might initially believe that they'll only be facing the local militias, but if they do manage to secure first the little bridge, and then the big bridge, and then get through into Tonbridge itself, there are a number of defensible enclosures and areas partitioned in the town itself, including the area around the parish church. The most striking feature of the town, of course, is the castle itself. We've done what we can to replicate the remains as shown in the mid-18th century engraving there. Huge dominating gatehouse keep, the ruins of the other keep up on the motte there, and then the remains of the towers and walls in various states of decrepitude. And we've put special rules onto different parts of the buildings. Some of them are able to mount cannons. The towers, however, we've determined are too ruinous to do so, although we can get infantry onto the walls. And in the open ground to the south of the town, there's also the remains of the old priory of Tonbridge. Again, an 18th century illustration of it there, and our representation of the tabletop, the priory ruins becoming the headquarters of the Duke de Richelieu. So, looking at Tonbridge from above, we have the main road from the south coming in from the bottom, past the priory remains. They go over the little bridge, through a little suburb, and then over the big bridge into the town itself, where there is the principal street, flanked by buildings, and behind them defensible yards, the churchyard, and of course, dominating everything, the remains of the castle itself. We should also add that we put a small ford crossing point on the lower branch of the river there, so that it's a little bit easier for the French to feed some men onto that sort of island that's formed between the two bridges. It is into this location then that the Duke of Richelieu marches his French army, and of course the only defenders that he's able to see initially around the bridge, the quayside by the river, are the West Kent militia and the Tonbridge gentlemen volunteers. Perhaps he thinks he'll have an easy task brushing them aside and forcing the crossing. He knows he has to force the crossing, though, because his cavalry detachments have returned from Maidstone and elsewhere, confirming there is no other way to get this army across the river without a major and slow diversion. And so it was on the 24th of January 1746 that the Battle of Tonbridge is fought between a Hessian army and a French army to decide who should sit on the thrones of Great Britain. After some consideration about deploying it in depth and using the enclosures of the town and fighting a street action, it was decided, in fact, by the Prince of Hesse-Kassel that he was simply going to stuff his men in deep formation along the road behind the barricades on the big bridge, lining the adjacent buildings and holding the quaysides. He was going to stop the French from building a bridgehead on the north side of the Medway. To give some flanking fire, they have also mounted one of their guns into the remains of the keep up there high on the motte overlooking the river. Meanwhile, the Duke has assembled the French infantry around the priory on the approaches towards the little bridge, and the action will be observed by Charles Edward Stuart's brother, Prince Henry Benedict, who has travelled across with the French expedition and is keen for a happy family reunion in the coming days, let's hope. So, the French army is prepared to advance towards Tonbridge, and it is preparing for what is surely going to be a fairly unpleasant and bloody operation. So Richelieu begins the action by moving his guns towards the lesser branch of the river and moving 2 regiments across the water over that little ford Now, the Hessians have declined to secure or garrison the buildings between the Little Bridge and the Big Bridge, so they lie open, ready for the French advance. And the French strategy is pretty much determined by the geography. They're going to bring their guns up to the river. They're going to bring some regiments across onto the island to secure the enclosures and the buildings overlooking the bridge from this side. And then they are going to also attempt to bring men round into this area, again to cover the bridge, whilst the main French attack goes straight up the middle towards the Hessian main body. The Hessians, apart from that gun on the motte, have put no bodies into the ruins of the castle at this point of the action. Without much ado, the French managed to secure the Little Bridge and start feeding men across into the island. And as we see Dillon and the Irish Brigade moving forwards over the Little Bridge, we can see in the distance the Duke de Fronsac beginning to move his forces into the enclosures on the island so that they can provide flanking fire, supporting those who will be forcing their way over the Big Bridge. So whilst the French artillery engages in a frankly fairly futile exchange of fire with the cannon mounted on the motte, Clare's regiment are able to get into a sheltered position beside the river and start exchanging fire with the Erpitz regiment of the Hessian forces. However, the Irish regiments that move forwards on the eastern side of the bridge flank, they come under fire from buildings that are on the other side and from the quayside itself, which is mainly manned by militia, and they start to take quite a lot of casualties for very little gain. And that's not least because, as well as the local militia and the gentlemen volunteers who are along the quayside, and the men from the Mansbach regiment that are in the adjacent buildings, the Hessians have got 2 cannon batteries mounted in this position, slightly sheltered, and they've got a limited angle of fire. But any French troops that come out into the open on the other side of the bridge are well within their sights. So it's pretty clear to Richelieu very early in the game that it's not going to be won by an exchange of fire over the river. He's going to have to grind his men forwards over the Big Bridge against the men beyond. Now, we have in our house rules given a form of sort of attack column status for parties that are assaulting objectives like bridges or indeed breaches for siege actions. So a form of column that can return fire and has some assault strength in hand-to-hand as well. So here we see the French regiment first crossing the bridge and engaging hand-to-hand with the Erpitz men on the other side of the barricades on the bridge, supported by Clare's to their flank and the Ruths over to the left. But the Dillons have been driven back from the bank by the Hessian artillery fire and a really determined effort from the gentlemen volunteers who are determined to prevent their town from being ravaged by a French army. Now, the French go in boldly and they do get as far as the barricade, but as you might expect, it's a tough nut to crack. They struggle to get through and the first French assault is a failure. And so, despite their heroism, the French are driven back from the barricades, but they've got no other option if they want to win this engagement, but simply to keep feeding men back into that mill. Of course, it's not all one way, and the Erpitz regiment do suffer casualties as they're there at the forefront of the Hessian defence of Tonbridge. And here we see the French assault columns massing, waiting for their turn to charge into the teeth of the Hessian fire and see if they can get themselves across the river and force a bridgehead into the town. It's a brutal battle of attrition on the far side of the bridge, but eventually the Erpitz is driven back by one of the battalions of the Orléans men, who are able to then clear the barricades and open up a space, and it looks for a tantalizing moment as if the French breakthrough has finally come. Over they get, forming line across the road and with the ruins of the castle on their flank, ready to exchange fire with the Mansbach regiment beyond. And then everything goes wrong. The French bridgehead collapses under the volleys of fire from the fresh Hessian troops, and then a succession of fire from in the buildings and from across the river. Although those cannons have got a narrow line of fire, they can just about get onto the men who are stacking behind, ready to cross, and some well-placed disorders able to put the French in a really difficult position. Their bridgehead no longer looking like an opportunity and more like a death trap. At this point, hoping to bring more guns to bear, the Hessians do move some men into the ruins of the castle, and there begins to be a little bit of long-range shooting across the river, which puts a little bit of pressure on Clares and is designed really to draw the fire of the French artillery and prevent there being any supporting fire offered for those assault columns. Now, at the height of the battle, the Prince of Hesse-Kassel himself, son-in-law to George II, of course, rides over to the West Kent militia, commends them on their service so far, and urges them forwards to the quayside to double the amount of firepower being put across the river and pressure the Irish brigade on that side too. This they do, and although they're only a militia unit with relatively low firepower stats, they are able to put more guns over the water, and the French beyond them have already suffered quite badly and are under a lot of strain and pressure. The French hold on to their bridgehead for as long as they dare, mainly because the regiments stacked up on the bridge have been disordered and are struggling to clear the space to allow any further movement. But now Richelieu is starting to realize he will not be able to win this battle. And so, with the Duke having come over the little bridge himself to help rally some of the regiments from the Irish Brigade, there he is with Dillon's in the yards of those houses. It is determined that the French will start pulling everybody back across both branches of the river back towards the Priory. And with the French abandoning their attempts to take Tonbridge, the battle comes to a close. The Hessians decide not to pursue or carry the battle over onto the other side of the river. Although the French have lost about a third of their manpower during the engagement, they still outnumber the Hessians. But what is their strategic objective now? They can't make a quick dash to London because they have to get over the Medway to do it. They've been thwarted. Any attempt to go downstream towards Rochester, where the next available crossing is, would simply be blocked by the Hessians there instead. To go the other way, they're going to have to go on a long diversion through difficult terrain, through wooded area, crisscrossed with small waterways, and then consider approaching London from the south, or tracking further west to try and link up with Charles Edward and the main Jacobite army. The alternative, of course, is, because it is winter, they don't have a large town able to accommodate all of their men, and the local populace is not exactly being cooperative for supplies, is that they pull back and attempt to create a consolidated position on the south coast, which makes it easier for them to be resupplied and reinforced. Let's hope from the French perspective that Charles Edward Stuart doesn't get into any bother in the north and is able to link up with it. And in fact, that's just what the Jacobites are doing. The voting for the Jacobite course of action decided that the Jacobites would continue their advance on London, but not directly from the south, but would swing round to the west in order to link up with the French. The only problem is George II doesn't want them to do it. He has decided to march out and stop them. Now, the king made his decision to leave London the day before the Battle of Tonbridge, whilst the Hessians were moving down towards that position. George has assembled literally every able-bodied man he can find in order to gain his field army of sufficient strength to face the Jacobites in the open field. That includes bringing part of the Royal Navy into dock so that it can strip it of marines. It means that he's brought every able-bodied militiaman in the south of England that's not fighting in Tonbridge together at the capital, as well as all the survivors of the previous engagement and the Guards Brigade. Now, the king has moved his army north into this landscape here, which is just north of St Albans. And this is a complicated landscape, although it's basically a rural area, and it's focused on the village of Sandridge. Now, the main roads that the Jacobites would cause to use, I'll highlight for you here. The Great North Road is there on the right-hand side of the screen, crossing the River Lee and then moving down through Lemsford Mills. Other approaches to St Albans that the Jacobites could take from their position at Welwyn as they come down could be through Weedhampstead, that way, or indeed over the other ford, which is just on the other side of Brocket Hall here. So if the Jacobites are going due south, they will take the main road on the right hand of the map, and if they decide to turn westwards, they will take the Weedhampstead or the Brocket Hall crossings. Now, George II has put himself in a position whereby he can control all of these by looking at these low hills that range above Sandridge village. As is becoming a bit of a habit in these videos, I've now turned the map upside down so it better reflects the photograph I took of the table. But just to highlight the main features, the river running through here, fairly unsubstantial river. There are crossing points in 1745 at Weedhampstead village, down there right at the bottom centre, on the side of Brocket Hall estate, which has not yet been manicured into the great Georgian palace that it became. And then there's the Lemsford Mills crossing the Great North Road, now over at the far left of the map. George II's HQ is based on Sandridge village, and he has drawn up his army across those three hills there, one of which is wooded. And most of the rest of the battlefield is fairly open, just dotted with a few small farms and enclosures. And here it is on the tabletop. Hopefully the river itself is pretty visible to you there at the bottom. Weedhampstead in the centre, Brocket Hall estate there, and the river crossing of the Great North Road over on the left, Brocket Hall ford, and the bridge at Weedhampstead there. Those are the three approaches of the Jacobite army, and George II's encampment across the high ground of the three hills in front of Sandridge village, which is there at the top of the table. A fairly open battlefield. Most of these hedgerows and enclosures have been determined as not being obstacles for the purposes of an engagement, should one happen to take place in this landscape around Sandridge. If we take a moment to have a look at the army that George II has deployed in this landscape north of St Albans. On his extreme right, covering the Great North Road at Lemsford Mills, we have the two regiments of dragoons, Cobhams and Kerrs, both of which have seen a lot of action in this campaign already. They're part of Hawley's division. We then have the Black Watch, who have not yet seen action in this campaign. They've been brought back across from the continent as part of the wider expeditionary force. And basically at this end of the line, a division basically made up of the survivors of the Duke of Cumberland's previous battles, a composite battalion of survivors from Spennymuir and a couple of regular infantry regiments. In the dead centre of George II's line is his elite division. We have the foot guards at the front, and in the second line we have the Royal North British Fusiliers as well, and in reserve behind you can see the Household Cavalry Division there. There's the Blues behind there. There are the Horse Guards and the Horse Grenadier Guards as well. So all of the elites out here onto the field. And of course, I should take a moment to say that George II is commanding in person. He has come out, it's his first battlefield command since the glorious victory at Dettingen a few years before, and he is determined to make this his battle, and hopefully his victory, he says. To the left of his centre, there are 2 regiments of Marines who've been brought in off the ships in order to expand the army, and that's one of the reasons why there's no shipping available at the moment to seriously threaten the French in the Channel, all of which might change, as well as a Nottinghamshire-based regiment there. And over on the far flank, there we have Albemarle and the militia division. There is the Canterbury militia, there is the Cambridge militia, there is the London Trains bands in there as well, and what is left of the Yorkshire Hunters militia who've been riding down with Cumberland since the campaign in the north. And the Jacobite army, Charles Edward Stuart marches his main body directly into this army on the 26th of January 1746. Charles Edward has far weaker intelligence of the enemy's positions. The population is not being particularly helpful, and the Jacobites, as they start swinging the way to the west, as directed by the Council of War decision made over on our social media, they start to move towards St Albans, and even if they hadn't done that, they would still have come against the flank of George's position at Lemsford Mills. Now, they have marched down from Welwyn on the morning of the 26th. They have done 4 or 5 miles march before they get there, and as such, we have put a time limit on what can be achieved on the 26th of January. The Jacobites don't have a lot of time in order to fight this battle in what remains of the short January day. Now, because the Jacobite army is not expecting the enemy to be fully deployed in strength, they were still under the impression that George II would be waiting for them in London and assembling the forces. The Jacobite vanguard arrives and doesn't really know what to do. It has to wait for the rest of the Jacobite divisions to come up in turn, one turn after the other. All of the Jacobite artillery is far behind the vanguard. So the Jacobites have to move onto the field slowly and steadily. They do this firstly with Perth's and Murray's divisions. Perth's coming in here over the Brocket Hall ford and moving towards the high ground in the centre, whilst Murray secures the crossing at Weedhampstead. The Prince himself coming up quickly behind, and no real movement made in the first few turns because the Jacobites are keen to build their force before launching attack. Perhaps remembering the Battle of Dunbar when they attacked piecemeal in the early phases and suffered quite badly as a result. As more and more Jacobite troops feed onto the field, the Prince orders Murray to start shogging his right flank out towards the west, so that they start to draw up against the militia, which it is believed is the weakest part of George's army and potentially the point that can be broken in first. So here we see the Stuarts of Appin, 2 battalions of the Athol Brigade, the small unit of the Cameron of Lochiel Regiment. They'd had quite a mauling at Spennymoor, trying to hold the village of Kirk Merrington, I think it was, and then out in support on the far flank, the Strathallan Horse. The army builds up over on the other side as well at the Brocket Hall ford. The Fitzjames Horse and Fitzligos moved forward, supported by the Derwentwater Dragoons, the English Dragoons from the north. And here we see the McLaughlins and Kilmarnock's Foot Guards moving up with the mortars that they've been carrying with them that did so well at the siege of Newcastle. And again at Spennymoor, the mortars are being carried with the regiment, or rather with the division, as opposed to being in the main artillery train. Now, the government forces were not just going to sit idly watching the Jacobites build up their strength. Instead, they started to move the 2 regiments of dragoons on their own flank round to Lemsford Mills to close that end of the battlefield off. They didn't want the Jacobites feeding anybody in over that flank and threatening them. So they have moved round. The smaller Jacobite cavalry force under the Earl of Kilmarnock moving up to screen the infantry from that formidable presence. And of course, when the dragoons charge, the Jacobite horse countercharge, because it's all they can do unless they're allowing those horses to ride into the clansmen behind. So Pitsligo's lead the way, smashing into the front ranks. It's an uneven battle, but the Jacobites are building up a strong body of support behind them. The first body of Jacobite cavalry are driven off, however. But the tide turns when the Fitzjames heavy French cavalry, although only a small unit, well powered, drive up forward with the support of Derwentwater's dragoons, and they succeed in breaking Kerr's dragoons who are charging in on them. Cobhams renew the fray, with Kerr's rallying behind them, making it somewhat less of a victory than it first appeared to the Jacobites. But as the clansmen come up in support, the British cavalry are forced to give way, and the Jacobites seem to be driving in on their left flank and start having grand schemes of being able to threaten the British Army's flank and potentially force them off the high ground. So we can see that action happening over at the top left corner of the battlefield. The Jacobite centre has secured the high ground at the centre of the field, and more regiments are coming up. Here you can see coming towards the bridge some of the lowland units. That's the Gordons and Ogilvies coming over the bridge there and deploying, with the French Royal Ecosse already in position. And there you can see Townley's regiment of English Jacobite infantry, with the George Cross there coming in, and the first of the Jacobite guns finally getting up onto the battlefield. Now, by this time, the afternoon is wearing on, but the Jacobites are determined to make some more progress over on the far end of the field, where they believe they can smash in the militia regiments that are over exposed on the farthest western hill. The Jacobite strategy is, if it can push round and break the cavalry on their left and push round and break the militia on their right, then they can win the battle without having to face the elite guards in the centre. So, as you can see, the Stuarts and the Athol men are moving forwards here towards the militia, wary of those marines to their left. And over on the right of the picture, the Camerons have charged in behind the 2nd Battalion of the Athol Brigade. Despite the ever-decreasing levels of light, the Athol men have smashed into the militia that they see there. I think that's the Canterbury militia. And the Strathallan horse have moved round threateningly into the rear. And exactly as Lord George Murray had hoped, the Canterbury militia are broken and scattered. The Athol men now facing the small regiment of the Yorkshire Hunters, and it seems that the plan is working. Starting to get dusky now as the Athol men charge into the Yorkshire Hunters, the Camerons drawing up in support behind. And sure enough, the Yorkshire Hunters are driven from the field as well. The British left appears to be collapsing. The Athol men are pretty exhausted by this time, but the Clan Cameron, exploiting the opportunity, they come smashing into the Canterbury militia there, and you can see the gun blazing away to their flank as the Stuarts and the other Athol regiment attempt to come up in support. However, turns to something of a disaster as cannon fire and close quarters canister shot shreds into the Athol Brigade as they advance, and they are driven from the field. The first Jacobite setback of the battle as the day is coming towards an end. To the other side of them, the Camerons are still locked in a bitter engagement with the militia. And in fact, as night falls and we reach our turn limit for the day, both armies agree to disengage and separate back out, both withdrawing the same distance from their position of engagement on the top of the hill. The summit of that hill is still open to play for. Now, we had a set of rules devised for continuing the battle into the night that posed all sorts of challenges for our commanders in terms of weakened command roles, shortened ranges for fighting, and regular break tests for anybody suffering a shock during the course of the engagement. Both commanders, however, determined that once this fight had disengaged, they were going to take the time to pause and consolidate, and not attempt to carry the battle into the darkness hours. But neither side was in the mood to retreat either, and so the Battle of Sandridge moves into its second day, its first full day of action, the 27th of January 1746, with Charles Edward Stuart determined now to break through King George's army and force his way to London and the throne. So we renew our narrative where we left it off, with dawn breaking as the Camerons sit there looking at the open summit of the hill, and beyond it the militia they'd been locked into fighting with the previous evening. During the night, some of the Guards' cavalry have been moved round to the flank to stabilise it, and this may well prove to have been enough to stem the damage. But nevertheless, George II's flank has been pushed off the top of the hill. And then, early in the morning, disaster strikes for the Jacobites. An attempt by the Clan Cameron to renew the battle with a charge against the militia is whacked by canister and volley fire, and the Clan Cameron, having already suffered heavy casualties at Spennymuir and having suffered casualties again the previous evening, are broken. The Jacobite right, all of a sudden, looks considerably more vulnerable. One of the best regiments on the Jacobite army has been destroyed largely by the attrition of this long, hard campaign. Also during the night, the British cavalry had been reshuffling on the other side of the field. The Blues had been ordered up to provide extra support for the Dragoons, who'd suffered a little bit during the previous day's action, and hopefully that might be enough at least to deter the Jacobites from exploiting their earlier advantage too hard. But of course, Prince Charlie knows that he cannot win the battle simply by looking at his enemy, so he does instruct the men on his left to push as hard as they can. The Jacobite cavalry, though, is much weakened by the previous day's actions. In fact, it's been heavily weakened ever since it suffered quite high losses in the final stages of the Third Battle of Dunbar. Nevertheless, Kilmarnock's men and the MacLachlan's here are ordered to move up and to keep the pressure on, and they do successfully, in fact, drive the Blues and Cobham's Dragoons back round towards their flank, falling back to support their infantry. It seems that on both ends, the Jacobites have succeeded in pushing the flanks in towards the centre, but they haven't broken them. And so it's time for the Jacobites to start getting much more assertive, and the Fitzjames cavalry, who'd done so well before against the Dragoons, they go charging on to try and exploit the pushback against the Dragoons, but facing against the Blues is a much different task, and those elite guards are able to not only hold their position, but push the Irish soldiers, the Franco-Irish soldiers, back towards their own lines. Although the British flank has been pushed back, it is not going to yield easily. And so by this point, the Jacobite hope of being able to win the battle on the flanks and avoid a general infantry slog in the centre appears to have been thwarted. And with so much of their army as yet uncommitted into the engagement, but sitting within artillery shot of the enemy, it is time for the Jacobites to consider a general assault. And of course, that is exactly what the prince determines to do, putting most of his faith on those towards the left-hand side of his line and the left of centre, because that's where his clan regiments are focused. In particular, he wants the Clandonald regiments, who are there formed on the high ground, to surge forwards and smash into the Royal North British Dragoons and hopefully break through. And they will be supported in their advance by the firepower of the Lowland regiments and the French Royal Écossaise, who will come up against the Guards to prevent the Guards being able to move out in support of those who are facing the charge. And so, with a cry of claymore, the Jacobite clansmen come storming down off the high ground in the centre, across the farmland, and here we see John Roy Stuart's regiment smashing into the Royal North British Fusiliers. Across the line, the Jacobites are charging through the closing fire of the enemy, with their terrifying charge smashing onto the bayonet lines to see, in this all-or-nothing charge, whether they can break through, carry their prince to London. And of course, as ordered, the Royal Écossaise, and here in front of us, Townley's English Jacobite regiment moved forward to put their firepower support in onto the Redcoat line in the hope that they will put enough pressure on to keep the British line busy whilst the charge smashes home. So here we see the early stages of the attack, the Lowland units, Ogilvy's and the Gordons, coming up there towards the centre of the British position, everybody trying to engage the Guards at arm's length with firepower rather than steel. The Stuarts of Appin charging in against the Marines over there as well, and just off screen, the Clandonald regiments preparing for their principal attack, which they hope will break Cumberland's veterans of Spennymoor over towards the far side. And now we have a really critical phase of the battle. The Clandonald regiments have come down off the heights and smashed into the government right. The Kilmarnock Foot Guards and the McLaughlins have pushed forwards as well, coming in on the extreme flank, and what's left of the Jacobite cavalry is there trying to hold off the Blues and the surviving British Dragoons. The left, however, of the British line is looking more solid because the casualties taken in the previous day and first thing morning have left that wing of the Jacobite army looking rather more vulnerable. And the firepower of the left of centre battalions of the British Army have successfully pushed back some of the Jacobite lowlanders, who were able to put much less pressure on than had been hoped. Now, at this point, Charles Edward had actually considered trying to disengage the army rather than see its losses mount up to a severe level. But he decided to have one more throw of the dice, and the final Jacobite reserve unit was thrown in against the Guards, and Townley's English Jacobites thrown in support. If, despite this being on paper the strongest point of the British line, they could break through here, then the potential for a Jacobite victory was considerable. So right across the line now, the Jacobites are engaged. There is no reserve behind them. Some of the Jacobite cannon are still struggling to get across the river and haven't yet fired a shot, but Kilmarnock is there on the flank, and he's managed to get the mortars up in support of his main infantry attack, and they start putting in fire against the Blues particularly, and that at least prevents the British army from being able to break out against the rather more vulnerable Jacobite cavalry. It seems at this point as if everything is still to play for both armies. This is a real nail-biter of a fight across this tabletop. But despite their advantage of their terrifying charge, at no point on the tabletop have the Jacobites successfully breached the British army's front line. And although casualties are mounting up on both sides, and although much of the British army's front line is disordered, the breakthrough hasn't yet come. Even the Jacobite mortars, firing over the heads of their own clansmen into the second line of the British army, aren't able to make the decisive difference. And so all Charles Edward's hopes are on this main new thrust, committing his final reserves in through against the Guards. It seems, though, that the pressure is intolerable for the British line, and the Jacobites do, the Clanranald men here, break through the British line. But they don't succeed in completely routing their enemy. They fall back rallying against the hedgerows behind. The Duke of Perth is up here in person, desperately trying to stabilise the position and urge his men on. Kilmarnock's foot guards are here now. They are not in support anymore. They're facing the close quarters volley fire from the composite survivors of Spennymoor because the MacLaughlans have finally been driven back. For every gain the Jacobites make, the enemy makes a counter gain somewhere else along the line. And then the unthinkable happens. The Coldstream Guards are broken. The Jacobite clansmen break through the front line of the strongest portion of King George's army. And it seems maybe that desperate gamble by the prince will pay off after all. The British army is about to be split down the middle. But again, the routing force is not completely destroyed. It falls back in disorder, but it rallies behind the second line along the hedge lines to the rear of their position, and with the second line holding firm, the Jacobite breakthrough is contained. Now, in this brutal maelstrom, where both sides are suffering heavy casualties and considerable disorder, the Jacobites find themselves unable to find the momentum to push through the line at any one point in enough strength to capitalise and actually break the enemy's army. This critical moment, the prince is starting to look along his line and assess the situation, and he sees Kilmarnock's foot guards routed, and now the Macphersons driven back behind the lines of the mortars. Fitzjames' horse countercharge into the Blues in the hope that they can hold off the British cavalry from breaking out just a little bit longer. But the Jacobite left is looking very vulnerable. George II, meanwhile, has decided that he's going to turn the Jacobite plan against them. They had hoped that they would be able to stave the British line in through the militia on the left. Well, now George II moves up with his Guards cavalry onto the left, and it is the militia who precede the first British advance of the day. And as you see here, the Marines and the Guards cavalry, preceded by the surviving militia units, are all pushing forwards on the Jacobite right flank. The Jacobites, as they start to fall back, are in danger of starting to fragment. So Murray's division over there on the Jacobite right starts to withdraw towards its starting positions nearer Wheathampstead. The much weakened Jacobite centre is also managing to hold its position, but will not be able to survive a protracted firefight if it left out in the open too long. And the British cavalry is threatening that Jacobite flank, breaking the Fitzjames horse and leaving only Derwentwater's dragoons to try and cover a Jacobite withdrawal on its left. At this point, the prince is aware that he can no longer muster the strength in any one place on the line to force his enemy back. The Jacobite army has to disengage and has to fall back. And of course, this is an operation of critical danger for the Jacobite army, because as they do this, they are under fire from the entire length of the British line. They are, however, now under the protection of their own artillery, which had been labouring behind them and had not brought up in time to make too much impact on their attack. Certainly the Jacobite right is the first to fall back towards the river near Wheathampstead. The centre starts to do so as well. It is only on the left that the extraction from the battlefield is extremely tricky. And so, as we see, the Jacobite right has successfully disengaged and withdrawn towards Wheathampstead, as has the Jacobite centre, covered by their guns, but the Jacobite left is much more vulnerable. Derwentwater's dragoons are driven back, and at that point Kilmarnock, bravely attempting to stand with the Macphersons, is overwhelmed by the charging Blues, and the Jacobite mortars are captured, or should I say recaptured, by the British horse. Those mortars have been with the Jacobite army since the Battle of Preston Pans, when our campaign began. The Clanranald regiments in the centre are virtually destroyed, only a handful of men being able to sneak off the battlefield. And so the Jacobite army survives the battle. It manages to come across the river during the late stages of the afternoon, having inflicted enough casualties on the British army and enough disorder on the British army that an effective pursuit is extremely difficult. It's mainly the lowland regiments, the English regiments, the French regiments that escape from the battlefield, along with the Jacobite artillery and some small amount of their cavalry. It has been a bloody, bruising 2 days for Charles Edward Stuart. His army has failed to break through the army of George II. The bells in London are ringing in triumph. And as the prince concentrates on trying to bring as much of his army off the field in order as he possibly can, he has to now come to terms with the fact that his campaign is in ruins. What remains of his army is now deep in hostile territory, and when he hears it the following day, he will also know that little hope remains of the French being able to break through to him quickly. Over 3 days, at the end of January 1746, the Prince of Hesse Castle and George II might well have saved George II's throne, and might well have done enough damage to the Jacobite cause, certainly to force his army back, and potentially to thwart Charles Edward's ambitions altogether. But whilst Charles Edward's hopes of marching into London this month might be over, the war is far from finished. There is still a French army in the south of England. There is still a Jacobite army north of London. The question is, will Charles Edward attempt to continue his pressure in England, or will he withdraw to the border and try and reconsolidate, link up with his garrisons, re-recruit his forces, maybe even negotiate a settlement? Will George II throw everything forwards in pursuit, or will he decide to concentrate on finishing off the French threat? Will his marines go back to their ships, and will the war move on to the seas? Who knows? There's an awful lot still to come. Thanks for watching.